In 1998, Britain's poet laureate, the legendary Ted Hughes, passed away. But rather than a gravestone appearing in the churchyard of his beloved home village of North Taunton, a mysterious memorial stone was winched into a secret location in one of the remotest areas of Dartmoor. The location was so well guarded and so inaccessible that it was 2 years before it was even found. So we begin this episode with two mysteries. Firstly, why was Hughes granted a memorial on Dartmoor at all? The Duchy of Cornwall, who owns the land here, does not allow them. And secondly, and perhaps more strangely, what's the point in a memorial that no one can visit? Welcome back to the Dartmoor podcast. In real life, I'm an English teacher, and this means I often need to force-feed impenetrable poetry to unwilling 15-year-olds. Sometimes I have to feign enthusiasm for poems I don't even enjoy myself. But Ted Hughes, the subject of today's Not a Podcast, is a poet who I'll never tire of talking about. His work is as powerful, surprising, wondrous and savage as Dartmoor itself. And joining me for this literary ramble was my good friend Darran, a fellow lecturer and Ted Hughes fanboy. And I mean ramble in both senses of the word, as our Ted Hughes pilgrimage would involve us stomping right out into the middle of the moors and talking a lot of waffle. Our adventure began at the scenic village of Belstone, where swallows swoop among the thatched cottages and the hills of the North Moor feel close enough to touch. But our start was delayed by a typical Dartmoor summer downpour. Never mind. It gave me a chance, while sheltering under some beech trees, to show you what all the fuss is about, and recite my favourite Ted Hughes poem, Work and Play. The title refers to a swallow who makes the work of feeding her young look like an effortless joy, and how this juxtaposes with a beach full of tourists who, though technically on holiday, are making it look like a struggle. The swallow of summer, she toils all the summer, a dark blue knot of glittering voltage, a whiplash swimmer, a fish of the air. But the serpent of cars that crawls through the dust, in shimmering exhaust, searching to slake its fever in ocean, will play and be idle, or else it will bust. The swallow of summer, the barbed harpoon, flings from the furnace a rainbow of purples, dips her glow in the pond and is perfect. But the serpent of cars that collapsed on the beach disgorges its organs, a scamper of colours that roll like tomatoes, nude as tomatoes, with sand in their creases to cringe in the sparkle of rollers and screech. The swallow of summer, the seamstress of summer, she scissors the blue into shapes and she sews it, she draws a long thread and she knots it at the corners. But the holiday people are laid out like wounded, flat as in ovens, roasting and basting with faces of torment as space burns them blue. Their heads are transistors, their teeth grit on sand grains, their lost children are squalling while man-eating flies jab electric shock needles, but what can they do? They can climb in the cars with raw bodies, raw faces, and start up the serpent and headache it homewards. A car full of sobbing and squabbles and stickiness, with sand in their crannies, inhaling petroleum that pours from the foxgloves, as the evening swallow, the swallow of summer, cartwheeling through crimson, touches the honey slow river and turning, returns to the hand stretched from under the eaves, a boomerang of rejoicing shadow. After reassuring Darran that I knew where I was going, we headed out of Belstone and began our trek. In 1984, Ted Hughes was made Poet Laureate, a post which he held until he became Dead Hughes in 1998. And this explains our first mystery. As Poet Laureate, as well as rather charmingly getting a barrel of sherry in payment every year, you build a relationship with the royal family for whom you produce poems for significant events. Hughes made a friend of the then Prince Charles, who was Duchy of Cornwall, owning a huge chunk of Dartmoor, and who would have the power to not only allow Hughes's memorial to be placed there, but also to commission a military helicopter to fly it into place. The mystery of why its location was kept a secret, though, is a somewhat more tragic story, and takes us in a bit of a dark direction. Trigger warning, as the young people would say. I would like to point out that I don't really relish talking about this stuff, but it is directly related to why Darran and I had to walk over 15 miles and brave some near impossible terrain to find the stone. Back in 1956, after knowing each other for just 4 months, Ted Hughes married the extraordinary young American poet Sylvia Plath. The story goes that on their first meeting, at a party to celebrate the launch of a literary magazine, Plath walked over to Hughes and bit him so hard on the cheek that she drew blood. You know, the way that all normal and healthy relationships start. It was with Plath that Hughes bought the house in North Taunton on the northern fringe of Dartmoor, and they lived there together for a short time with their 2 children. But this fell apart when Hughes began an affair with aspiring poet Assia Wevill back in London. In 1962, Plath committed suicide by asphyxiation using a gas oven. Beloved as she was as a mercurial and visceral poet of incredible talent, and a writer who powerfully communicated the female experience of suffocation in a patriarchal society, there was an outpouring of grief for her. And, of course, Hughes, with his philandering and the rumoured abusive behaviour, ended up getting the blame. It didn't help that he now also had ownership of her posthumously published poetry. And tragedy piled upon tragedy when Wevill, just 6 years after Plath's death, killed herself in the same way, also taking the life of her and Hughes's 4-year-old daughter, Shura. Hughes was hounded by Plath fanatics for years. They would shout "murderer" at him while he made poetry readings, and threats were made to his life. And most significantly to our story today, Sylvia Plath's grave was repeatedly vandalised, with the name Hughes being chipped off the headstone. It seems likely that this led Hughes to request his own stone was to be laid where it could not be tampered with, in a secret location, sequestered among the rugged and inhospitable valleys of the deep moor. Phew, that was heavy, wasn't it? Let's talk to Darran for a bit to cheer ourselves up.
Well then, Darran, welcome to the Dartmoor podcast.
I thought it wasn't a podcast.
Well, technically, you might be right. Let's start with you, Darran. What's your
What
connection?
brings me here?
Yeah, what brings you? Who the are you? What have you got to do with Dartmoor, Darran?
I've got very little to do with Dartmoor, except that when I moved here in '98, I spent a lot of time up here, sort of like exploring it because it was different from the city. I'd been a city boy in London, I'd also had a sort of background in sort of reading bits of Ted Hughes when I was younger, when I was about early 20s. Got a copy of Crow, which was very surreal and absurd and mythopoeic and all those things. And it was a little bit later that I discovered the earlier poems like Wind and Hawk Roosting and The Thought Fox and things like that, and I got into him a little bit then. And I've taught him for quite some time.
Yeah, you mentioned Crow. That's one which I've seen you sort of like running around with and photocopying and teaching before, but I've never read any of the Crow stuff. How does that sort of fit into the Ted Hughes kind of?
It's interesting in that most of the early poems, many of the early poems anyway, there's a variety of themes, but many of them are animal poems or poems about the kind of the energies of the universe and wind and things like that. And the Crow poems are slightly different. They're kind of more of a kind of narrative, a myth of this kind of apocalyptic survivor character. And of course some people have read that biographically, in the sense that, you know, they've thought of him surviving, you know, the death of Sylvia Plath and the subsequent death of his common law wife Assia Wevill. Obviously I don't really want to get into the the sort of debates about who was right and who was wrong about these issues in terms of their personal lives. But some people have suggested that the Crow poems are about an adjustment, a survival, a mechanism, creative sort of survival mechanism for that kind of trauma. But I don't know whether that's the case.
Yeah.
But they're very playful. They're very kind of they're surreal, grotesque, cartoon-like. And I think they definitely were my first port of call for reading him.
Well, we'll definitely talk a bit more about like the poetry and stuff in a bit. I don't want to sort of focus on like the sort of ghoulish and sort of salacious sort of parts of like his life, but it sort of is relevant to what we're doing today, because obviously we're off to go and find his memorial stone, and it was plonked in the middle of nowhere at his behest, and deliberately hard to find, and that's because people were worried it would be sort of vandalised or defaced. I mean, how unfair do you think it is, really, that sort of Ted Hughes got the blame for Sylvia Plath's suicide?
Well, it's difficult because nobody really knows what goes on in a relationship. I think it's a really kind of dangerous area to go into. I certainly never talked a great deal in classes about that area. One of the things that I remember in a documentary about it was Germaine Greer saying something like, he was like, she claimed, having been one of the feminists that would have kind of vilified him in the late 60s, early 70s, had come round to the perspective that he was kind of attracted to quite self-destructive women. But I think that it's a very dangerous sort of area to sort of condemn somebody without knowing the full facts. And so it doesn't surprise me anyway that Ted Hughes fans have kind of made such a mystery of the memorial stone, given the actions of people in the early 70s and sort of late 60s, when there was a tide of reaction against him. So I myself tend to divorce the artist from their biography anyway. I think I was taught to do that at university. I think it's probably the safest way. I think when you're dealing with art, you should be considering, it as art rather than it's something that is attached to some dark biographical motivation or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, you're 100% right, I think. More importantly, I mean, what makes Ted Hughes special, do you think?
I think that I think why I still get a kick out of reading him, and my students tend to as well, is that he kind of makes the world come alive in all its kind of naked glory and its blood and its guts and its violence and its beauty, and he does all those things very succinctly in lyric poems. But I think that he animates the world, and I think we were in a room not so long ago, weren't we, where there was this Spinoza quotation that came up, which was, God is not he that is, but that which is, as if that God is in the kind of the fabric of the universe and the connections and the causal connections of the universe, and that is what we might call God, rather than some sort of spirit in the sky, if you like. And I think he articulates that very well in his or illustrates it very well in his poems. If you think about it, for example, when we were walking up, there was we suddenly got a bit of a kind of wind blowing over the clouds, blowing over the hills. And it reminded me of these lines here. This house has been far out at sea all night, the woods crashing through darkness, the booming hills, winds stampeding the fields under the window, floundering black astride and blinding wet. Till day rose, then under an orange sky, the hills had new places. That line, the hills had new places, the idea of a kind of a super force, I think, as Simon Armitage once called it, a kind of described the poem as kind of animating a kind of super force in nature. And we experience wind all the time, but he kind of represents it in a much more powerful way with the use of language, and it is like that. Once there's been a storm, it does feel like the world has been rearranged in some kind of way.
Yeah, it's wonderful. That's one of my favourites as well. It's got the Spirits is like flexing like the lens of a mad eye when he's talking about like the sky moving. Oh, that's fantastic.
That's right. It's that kind of play of very dark green light and then sudden flashes of white and orange. And that was in the next two lines, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Blade light, luminous black and emerald, flexing like the lens of a mad eye.
Yeah.
And then the poem goes on to deal with the struggle, scaling along the house side as far as the coal house door, and the denting the balls of your eyes, and the tent of the hills drummed and strained its sky rope. The way in which the hills could almost lift off in a kind of, Wizard of Oz, Dorothy kind of way.
Yeah, it's wonderful, and he's I know he's from Yorkshire, isn't he? But it's so perfect for Dartmoor, Ted Hughes.
Yes,
you can see why he moved here, because it is just this landscape of just wild sort of power and untamedness. It just suits him perfectly. And lots of birds and animals in there, which does it for me as well.
Yeah, he's really good on animals, and he's great at kind of tors and rocks and having. There's one poem I don't know as well off by heart called Pibroch about.
Yeah, I love the. I think you've already sort of touched on it really, but yeah, just the way he talks about nature and animals is not like in any way cutesy, is it? It's really savage. And so much like just talking about like animals in a very like, I don't know, just the nihilistic nature of nature, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is about just consciousless sort of.
Yeah, hawk roosting is good for that. Misremembering the lines probably, but the one path of my flight is direct through the bones of the living, or something like that.
So my manners are tearing off heads.
Yeah.
yeah, it's wonderful. Yes, Ted Hughes, his poetry and Dartmoor just belong together. Deep and powerful meditations on the landscape and the creatures within them. Even without the threat of a furious feminist defacement, this would be the perfect place for a Hughes Memorial. In 1970, Hughes returned to live in North Taunton with his new wife Carol Orchard, and he would remain there until the end of his life. As well as laureating away and no doubt getting stuck into that barrel of sherry, Hughes bought a nearby farm and raised livestock, the subject of his 1979 collection, Moortown Diary. Here, as if you'd expect anything else, Hughes talks about farming the Devon landscape in all its grim glory. Stillborn lambs are torn apart by ravens. Cattle glare accusingly out of the torrential rain and churn up their muddy fields. Personified tractors freeze to death, and flocks of birds panic in the savage Dartmoor weather. You can tell he loved it. In the introduction, he writes this of the Devon farmers. The farmers lived lightly in the day and the year, but heavily in that long backward perspective of their ancient landscape and their homes. The breed was so distinct, so individualised and all of a piece, they seemed to me almost a separate race. I could believe they were still that Celtic tribe the Romans had known as the Dumnoni, the people of the deep valleys, a confederacy of petty kings hidden in their strongholds that were only just beginning to emerge out of the old oak forest. From Oak Tor, where we conducted our interview, our walk took us down into a deep gully on the side of the imposing Steeperton Tor to cross the infant River Tor at Knackmine Ford. Sorry, snuck in a few Dartmoor 365s there. When he wasn't farming or writing, Hughes was fishing. In his later life, it seems that this was a true passion of his. And perhaps this was the first clue for the BBC's Simon Hall, who first found Hughes's memorial after 2 years of searching. You see, the stone is laid at a boggy patch of ground that marks the head of the River Tor, a river that flows through North Taunton, and a place that Hughes fished religiously. Nowadays, the location of the stone is no longer a guarded secret. You can find plenty of descriptions of its location online, and even the GPS coordinates. You can actually see it, just about, on Google Earth if you zoom in enough. But that didn't mean it was going to be easy. Darran and I had made relatively light work of the long march out here, but to get to the Tor Head, we were going to have to leave the path.
I think this is just going to be grim for about a mile, well, less than a mile.
The last mile of our outbound journey was some of the most challenging terrain I've ever encountered on Dartmoor. Without a clear path, we were blindly stepping into a dense jungle of knee-high grass which hid uneven ground, threatening to turn an ankle or worse. More than once I sunk up to the shins in cold, peaty sludge, and by the time we neared the mound on which the monument sits, our calves were aching from the effort of making the long, careful strides through the dense vegetation. And this sort of exercise is as mentally draining as it is physical. There's a part of your brain that wants to get out of it as fast as possible, urging you to panic and attempt to charge away full tilt, a thought that you must constantly suppress so that you can concentrate on not doing yourself an injury. It was grim, but we made it.
I'm not really into high fives, but I think. Well done.
Little more than a name and a date carved into a large oval slab and laid atop a mound in a boggy and featureless landscape. There was a gentle beauty to the spot, though. A little stream, the beginnings of the Tor, gurgled past, and meadow pipits chirped from the rushy valley sides. The wind sent clouds scudding past, causing dark shadows to sail by over the wind-bent grass. Already sunburnt, windswept and tired, Darran and I began the return journey. There's something pretty satisfying about having to work that hard to visit a monument. I think if it were a statue in a town square, I'd have given it a glance and moved on. There couldn't have been a more appropriate home for the Ted Hughes Memorial Stone than the source of the river he loved, out among the wild and savage moors that inspired so much of his poetry. And not only that, but the long walk through the imposing landscape and the pretentious discussions with brainy Darran really made me reflect on the life and works of Dartmoor's great poet. We won't be doing it again though. It was knackering. I think Darran hit the nail on the head when he talked about Hughes animating the world. And that's what a great poet should do. There's a Percy Shelley quote which says, "Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar." A good poem makes you see the hills and rivers and swallows and tractors as if you're seeing them again for the first time. And Hughes, I feel, really captures that hidden beauty, as well as a hidden darkness and brutality that perfectly reflects the spirit of Dartmoor. Let's do another poem to tie it together. This one's called Leaves, and calls together a lot of the motifs and proper Ted Hughesy themes we've touched on today. Who's killed the leaves? Me, says the apple. I've killed them all. Fat as a bomb or a cannonball, I've killed the leaves. Who sees them drop? Me, says the pear. They will leave me all bare, so all of the people can point and stare. I see them drop. Who'll catch their blood? Me, says the marrow, the marrow. I'll get so rotund that they'll need a wheelbarrow. I'll catch their blood. Who'll make their shroud? Me, says the swallow, there's just time enough before I must pack all my spools and be off. I'll make their shroud. Who'll dig their grave? Me, says the river, with the power of the clouds, a brown deep grave I'll dig under my floods. I'll dig their grave. Who'll be their parson? Me, says the crow, for it is well known I study the Bible right down to the bone. I'll be their parson. Who'll be chief mourner? Me, says the wind, I will cry through the grass, the people will pale and go cold when I pass. I'll be chief mourner. Who'll carry the coffin? Me, says the sunset, the whole world will weep to see me lower it into the deep. I'll carry the coffin. Who'll sing a psalm? Me, says the tractor, with my gear-grinding glottal, I'll plough up the stubble and sing through my throttle. I'll sing the psalm. Who'll toll the bell? Me, says the robin, my song in October will tell the still gardens the leaves are over. I'll toll the bell. I hope you enjoyed watching, everyone. See you next time.